The book is The Book of Matt by Stephen Jimenez, who's in the studio today after going all the way to Laramie to talk to a crowd over there yesterday. But before I get into the book, we need to do a setup of who you are. I was reading the back jacket of this. You've got quite a career going. You're from where?
I'm originally from New York City,
Okay.
Glenn, but I divide my time between Santa Fe, New Mexico, and New York City. I'm a native of Brooklyn, New York.
Okay. And what kind of work have you been doing over these years?
You know, I'm an investigative reporter and journalist. I produce television. I've had some background in screenwriting and producing long-form documentaries for television. Have been a teacher. I taught at New York University for 10 years. But, you know, the work that brings me to Wyoming is my work as an investigative journalist.
Okay, so that brings us to the book then, which is, again, The Book of Matt. Now, how did you find out about the story then, and what drove you to come to Wyoming to cover the story?
Sure. Well, let me just say that I first started visiting Wyoming almost 30 years ago. There's a foundation in the northeastern part of the state, the Ucross Foundation, and I was an artist in residence there many years ago. But on that trip, it was my first trip to Wyoming, and I absolutely fell in love with the state. So when the news broke about the Shepard murder, I began to follow the case in the media and made the decision right after the trials to make a trip to Laramie. I had followed the case in the news and wondered how it would resolve itself. But when I first came out to Wyoming, made my first trip to Laramie, it was with the idea of writing a script for a made-for-television movie about the hate crime, because all of the coverage I read seemed so clear that it was unmistakably an anti-gay hate crime. And being a gay guy myself, I thought this was an important American story. When I got to Laramie and I started going through the newly unsealed case records and began talking to people, notably the prosecutor in the case, Cal Raruca, I began to realize that there was a whole other story that had been completely missed. And so it was that really plunged me on a long investigative journey, because initially I came to write, as I said, a script and to better educate myself. Once I started going into the records and I started talking to people, I realized there was another story there. So we're talking about, this was back in February of 2000 when I came to Laramie the first time. So this has been a story I've been involved with for 18 plus years.
Now, here's what I find interesting as you personally, we'll get back to the Matthew story, but you, because there are some people that when they hear a certain narrative and they believe a certain narrative, something comes along to destroy that narrative and they end up living in denial. What makes you, especially as a journalist, look at the story and say, well, I guess what I've heard is wrong, and so I'm going to go dive into this, and maybe I need to throw out everything I believe? What's the difference between you and these other people?
Well, you know, that's a really good question. I think what it is that, you know, when I began talking to people in Laramie, beyond the prosecutor, I found that there were really credible people, and they started to say the media really misrepresented this. And so I began looking at what they said, okay, what these you know, firsthand sources were telling me, and what I found in the original reporting, and I realized there was a big disjuncture between those two things. And you know, it was a decision I had to make, and you know, it was really about 2 years into the work when I really had to ask myself, am I going to go forward with this? Because this is going to ruffle some feathers. But, you know, if you think about the principles of journalism, journalism has nothing to do with our individual political beliefs or, you know, what we want it to be. Journalism is about uncovering the truth.
Okay. So let's get into then the truth of the story and the truth who Matthew Shepard really was, because I've heard from public media in the area and from other news sources, they've been delivering a certain narrative of what seemed to be this nice, innocent young guy. And I have no idea what his personality type really was like. Did you get a sense for the personality type while you were researching?
The personality of Matthew Shepard?
Yeah.
Well, I think Matthew Shepard, he was a college student, as you know, at the University of Wyoming, okay? He was starting as a freshman at the University of Wyoming, but he had been to 2 schools before that. He had gone to college in North Carolina, dropped out of school in North Carolina, then took classes at a community college in Casper, and then ultimately ended up, after living in Denver for a while, ended up at the University of Wyoming. Matthew was a very interesting character. He was interested in a lot of things. He was intellectually curious, okay, had gone to boarding school in Switzerland, but he was also a troubled young man in that he had struggled with a lot of different issues. And over time, I discovered what some of those issues were.
Yeah. Was it the issues that caught up with him that was the ultimate demise? In other words, because I also heard stories about, let's say, a darker side of his life.
Right. Well, the darker side of Matt's life was the darker side of a lot of people's lives. If we're going to talk about crystal meth, there was a time in Wyoming where Wyoming had the highest rates of crystal meth addiction per capita in the country.
It's still pretty high now.
Okay. Well, this was a time. This murder happened in October of 1998. And at that time, the meth epidemic was really expanding. And this went into the early 2000s, And so that same meth epidemic that was going on here in Wyoming and in other parts of the country was also going on in urban gay communities. It began in San Francisco, New York, L.A., and it began to spread to other places. But certainly by 1998, meth was being used as well in the gay community, including in Fort Collins and elsewhere. So I began looking into that. What was going on in Denver? What was going on in Fort Collins and in Laramie? So when we talk about the dark side, crystal meth played a big part in this story.
Would you say, if we went back and took a look at his life, that he had any kind of criminal record up to the point of his death, or anything that would have raised suspicion or red flags?
Well, there were some issues when we say a criminal record. He had some incidents. There was some things that happened in Casper, which I believe were expunged from the record. But I looked into some of that and actually spoke to a police officer that was involved in that case and the mother of one of the victims. Another case that happened in Cody, Wyoming, that I learned just from a police officer the other day, that appears to have been expunged too. Although when I got hold of the records, it was before the records no longer became available. So yes, there were some troubles. When you say criminal, I can't say that these were things that resulted, where he was convicted in a jury trial. But in the instance of what happened in Cody, is that Matthew had an altercation with a bartender there, and during that, the bartender punched Matthew. And when Matthew was treated at the hospital, he said that he had been, first reported that he had been raped by 5 guys.
Right.
It turned out he withdrew that. And again, I interviewed the bartender, got hold of public records. And so, as he reported it and what actually happened were very, very different. He was a troubled young man.
Yeah.
I just want to say, because he was troubled, of course, that's no excuse for the violence of this horrific murder that happened in Laramie in October of 1998.
No, that makes complete sense. So, and there again, I'm trying to get a sense for his personality type, because usually when you say someone's a troubled young man, and in a case like this, people want to demonize someone, and I wanted to know, was he a nice guy that just took a wrong path, a wrong turn somewhere? Or was he some kind of a punk thug? Do I put him somewhere in the middle? I'm trying to figure out the personality.
So let me say, I don't think he was a punk thug.
Okay.
I think this was a guy who was really interested in a lot of things. I think he was interested in politics and international relations. He spoke a couple of languages. He was well educated. I think he was intellectually curious. I think he was emotionally troubled. And I would say that probably, if I had to guess, I would say one of the reasons he got into some of the things he got into is that I think he was really looking for a place to belong. He had lived in different places. There were problems along the way. And I think he fell into things in many ways similar to the perpetrators in this case, who each in their own way fell into some things.
Okay, then that does lead us to, what are the events that led up to his eventual demise? Can you give us a step-by-step story scenario?
Sure. So I'm going to begin with the real perpetrator in this crime, Aaron McKinney. Now, both Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson, in all of the national media coverage, it was stated that McKinney and Henderson beat Shepard to death. McKinney and Henderson targeted Shepard because he was gay, and they were painted with the same colors there, right?
Yeah.
over time, these are two very, very different individuals, okay? Aaron McKinney had been dealing meth for 3 years prior to this crime. He was a meth addict, okay? He was a young kid who was getting in trouble increasingly. A few months before this, he had burglarized a Kentucky Fried Chicken in Laramie and then fled to Florida, okay? So he was a kid who had been in trouble as a juvenile and was going down a road that most likely was going to lead to more serious crime. Russell Henderson, the accomplice, okay, did not have any kind of a felony record. He had been an Eagle Scout. You know, there's a great picture that I have in my book where Russell Henderson is receiving his Eagle Scout badge from former Governor Mike Sullivan. Aaron McKinney knew Matthew Shepard before the night of the crime. Russell Henderson did not. In fact, Aaron McKinney knew Matthew Shepard longer than he had been friends with Russell Henderson. When they left the bar that night, okay, with Matthew Shepard, Russell Henderson believed that a robbery was going to take place, but he did not know the circumstances behind. There was previous discord between Aaron McKinney and Matthew Shepard, okay? Aaron McKinney and Matthew Shepard had been friends. They had partied together, and I've got multiple sources on this that I mention in the book. They had partied together, and some of that partying involved, you know, the use and sale of crystal meth, okay? Russell Henderson had used meth, but he was neither a dealer nor an addict, okay? On the night of the crime, Aaron McKinney believed that Matthew Shepard, okay, was going to have in his possession 6 ounces of meth. The meth was part of a regular shipment that would come from Denver. It was the total shipment was 12 ounces. 6 ounces would be dropped in Fort Collins, and 6 ounces would go on to Laramie. And on this particular night, at the last minute, Matt had been kind of called off this run, okay? Aaron didn't know that. Aaron thought that Matthew was either going to have the 6 ounces or he was going to have the money from having unloaded it in Laramie. And so that was what was behind the crime. Again, Russell Henderson, when they left the Fireside Bar, believed that McKinney had robbery in mind, which he wasn't enthusiastic about going along with, but he did, all right? So, you know, again, if you go back to the official media story that was told by everyone, okay, from Time Magazine to the New York Times to the Denver Post, was that 2, and I'm saying quote unquote, rednecks walked into a bar and decided to target Matthew Shepard because he was gay, that they lured him out of the bar on some kind of sexual promise. There were many different narratives that circulated. One of them, generated by Aaron McKinney's girlfriend, Kristen Price, was that when they were in the bar, Matt Shepard had come on to Aaron McKinney, made a sexual advance on Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson. And in her words, they decided to take him out and beat him up to teach him a lesson not to come on to straight people. In the course of my reporting, and back in 2004, I produced an hour for 2020 on this case. Kristen Price, on camera, admits that she had fabricated this in hopes of helping Aaron McKinney get out, okay? When she was on 2020 back in 1998 when the crime happened, she was in shadows. She wasn't, you know, you didn't see her full face. When she was in the piece that I did in 2004, she's, you know, directly speaking right to the camera, admits that she lied and that she and McKinney had come up with this as an alibi, thinking that maybe this would help Aaron McKinney's cause if they claimed Matthew Shepard had come on to him. McKinney later admitted that's not what happened. He admitted that his intent was to rob Matthew, okay, and that really the fact that Matthew was gay was not a motive. You know, if we go deeper, then we can talk about the sexuality of Aaron McKinney, which is complicated.
Okay. Now, this is where, when we get into everything that you just laid out for us, this is where, of course, there are those who say, well, you're just making this up. These are wild conspiracies. It's hearsay. But in the book, do you lay out proof of what you're saying?
Of course I do, Glenn. I lay out proof that is beyond the standards of almost all journalism that we see in print or in television, okay? In the book, I have listed well over 100 named sources, okay? Recently, there was a video someone generated in Wyoming suggesting that all of my sources were anonymous, okay? Who are my sources, okay? the prosecutor in the case, Cal Raruca, the former Albany County attorney, who won the convictions against McKinney and Henderson, and he prosecuted this case. He was one of my leading sources, and he was my first and most important source. Ben Fritzen, who is a homicide detective in the case, who not only investigated this case, but he had followed Aaron McKinney's previous drug dealings and had investigated him for that. Okay, Flint Waters, who recovered the murder weapon and arrested Russell Henderson, on the night of the crime. Flint Waters at that time was working locally as a police officer in Laramie, but he later went on to work for the DCI as one of the principal investigators in Laramie working on drug cases. So he's very, very familiar. I could go on. Mark Beck, another law enforcement officer in Laramie, who is one of my main sources. And there are many others, okay? Because this is something, when people talk about anonymous sourcing, I also had the first, and really up until now, exclusive interviews with McKinney and Henderson, okay? And their girlfriends, Kristen Price and Chastity Pasley, all of whom are named in the book. In addition to that, the sources I use are the original transcripts, the original statements when they were questioned and interviewed by the police, their families, their friends. I interviewed 12 friends of Matthew Shepard, including former lovers. All of these people are named in the book. So this notion that these are anonymous sources or this is a conspiracy theory is completely bogus. I guess someone just doesn't want to know what the truth is.
Well, and that's why, as you were naming sources, I thought, well, if that's the case, all I have to do is go to the back of the book, list of sources, subject to interview, Book of Matt, ABC News 2020, and then it's several pages of sources here. Okay, now what about, you mentioned documentation. Are there anything in the book where people can look at let's say a photocopy or something of a document, let's say in court?
Sure, because it's not that there is a photo document, okay, but I do quote in the book a number of the documents, and I say exactly where the document came from. In other words, if Kristen Price gave 3 different statements to the police, I tell you which statement it was to the police and on which day. If I have a document where Aaron McKinney smuggled a letter to Russell Henderson in the jail telling him to go along with a certain alibi, I tell you exactly where that letter came from, and I quote it, okay? Yeah. So there are many, many documents that I used in the book, okay? But I always tell you where those documents came from.
Okay, so now, I've just got a few minutes left with you here. So why the resistance then? When you have this much documentation, why is there not only continued narrative in some media outlets in Wyoming and across the country, but even if you head over to our state museum right over here, there's a little Matthew Shepard picture with a little bit about the story, and it's not the narrative that you brought up, but the same narrative that, well, of course, he was just beaten up by a couple of people who wanted to teach a homosexual a lesson. Why is that still out there? Why can't we get rid of it?
The reason I believe, Glenn, that it's hard for people to look at some of the difficult and complex truths of this case is that the media got set, the myth got set in stone very, very quickly. In the book, I show where it began with 2 friends of Matthew who, before the police had done any kind of complete investigation, began calling gay organizations in the state, calling people in the media, and saying that they believed Matt Shepard was attacked because he was gay. They had no direct knowledge of the crime, but that story got picked up. It was put out on Associated Press, okay, and it became national news within a couple of days. That story got set in stone. It created incredible public reaction, in part because of the horrific violence of the crime. I mean, Matthew, Aaron McKinney struck Matthew with the barrel of a .357 Magnum more than a dozen times. And, he was tied to a fence and left there for 18 hours. So it was a grotesque crime. Yeah. If you know anything about meth-related crime and what happens when someone, in this case, Aaron McKinney, had been up on meth for a week, okay? When a crime like this happens, meth crimes are, often grotesquely violent like this. But, to answer your question in short form, I think the myth was very serviceable, okay? And I would just say, I'd say as a gay man that I think, I'm certainly opposed to violence against gay people simply because they're gay. In this case, there were more complicated factors, and I don't care what someone's sexuality is, whether you're straight, gay, bi, whatever it is. Let's look at the truth. Let's look at the facts.
Okay, you had a meeting. It was in Laramie the other night. Pretty good crowd apparently showed up.
Yeah, the crowd was completely full. It was the large ballroom at the Hilton Garden Inn, and it was standing room only in the back. So I want to say maybe 220 people there. And,
Sure.
a very, very engaged conversation. People were really interested. And, the last event I did in Laramie was back in February of 2014. And that event also was very well attended. So I wondered, are people still interested in talking about this? But for a community forum like this,
Sure.
boy, people came out.
But why there? Why not on the university campus?
The University of Wyoming has been, they've been reluctant, to allow a forum to take place where the journalistic truths here can be looked at, There has been only one narrative that has been told at the University of Wyoming, and it's what I call the official narrative, They've now cast me as having alternative facts. But what I want to say to you is this, In a Wyoming court, Matthew Shepard was never, Matthew Shepard's assailants were never convicted of a hate crime. They were never found guilty of a hate crime, This was something that was decided by the media, and through the media, the court of public opinion, But there was never legally in this case, and the prosecutor himself has said that there was not sufficient evidence of a hate crime. So it was decided that it was, and so now it is.
Okay, but it's not just because I keep picking on the media, but then again, that's what I do. But it's not just the media. There's some political figures out there.
You're absolutely right. And I think that there are some people that are really defending the mythology. And you've got to separate something. The cause for, equal rights for everyone, that cause is I completely support that. But I also believe none of us benefit as citizens in a democracy, If we're going to exercise our rights as citizens, we need to understand what is truth and what is not.
Any political figures here in the state of Wyoming that have pushed back against you?
Not directly.
Okay.
No one. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. I don't know that this person is a political figure. I believe they're running for office here in Cheyenne. There's a woman by the name of Sarah Burlingame, and I noticed that in the Laramie Boomerang this morning, she was quoted as calling me a snake oil salesman or a snake oil something or other. Whatever it is, I find it outrageous that anyone running for political office, would be smearing a journalist because whoever it is doesn't like what the journalist is reporting.
Wow. All right. The book is The Book of Matt, and it's on sale bookstores everywhere, I would assume, right?
Bookstores and Amazon's a great place to find it.
Amazon.com. Okay. Hey, thank you very much for coming in. It's been a delight to talk to you and get the full story here, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I appreciate the one that you gave to me, and you gave one for me to give away.
I did, Glenn.
I'll be
Thank
doing
you.
that. Thank you very much. The Book of Matt. Look it up.
Boy, that was a fast interview. I'm going